It was the 19th century's biggest bestseller and a suicide note for his career. In 1 week, Ludwig Büchner went from a respected professor to a public enemy, exiled from the universities for a single, dangerous idea: that there is no ghost in the machine. He stripped the universe of its magic to save us from our delusions. But was he a martyr for the truth, or a fool who destroyed his own life for a gospel of dirt? Ludwig was born in Darmstadt, the capital of the Grand Duchy of Hesse. On the surface, the Büchner family appeared to be the epitome of respectable German bourgeoisie. His father, Ernst Karl Büchner, was a distinguished physician who eventually rose to the rank of medical counselor. But inside the Büchner household, the atmosphere was anything but conventional. It was an incubator for genius and rebellion. Ludwig was the third surviving son in a sibling group that would leave an indelible mark on German history. The eldest was Georg Büchner, a name that still resonates in German literature with the force of a thunderclap. Georg was a writer of frightening intensity, the author of Woyzeck and Danton's Death, and a radical revolutionary who penned the pamphlet The Hessian Courier with the incendiary slogan, "Peace to the shacks, war on the palaces." Georg died of typhus in 1837 at the tragically young age of 23, when Ludwig was just 13 years old. The shadow of this lost genius loomed large over Ludwig's adolescence. Georg had been a student of science and medicine, as well as a poet, and his worldview, bleak, realistic, and deeply empathetic to the suffering of the common man, seeped into the family's DNA. Then there was his sister, Louise Büchner, who would grow up to be one of the most significant voices in the 19th century German women's rights movement. Another brother, Alexander, became a professor of literature and a legal scholar. Another, Wilhelm, became a politician and factory owner. It was a house where silence was rare, and debate was the daily bread. Growing up in this environment, Ludwig absorbed two critical lessons. First, he learned to revere science. His father's medical practice brought the realities of life and death into the home. There was no room for squeamishness. Second, he learned to distrust authority. The Büchners were liberals in a reactionary state. They saw the hypocrisy of the aristocracy and the stifling conservatism of the church. They believed in progress, in reason, and in the power of the human intellect to solve its own problems. While Georg had channeled his rebellion into literature and political conspiracy, Ludwig's temperament was different. He was steadier, more methodical. He possessed the same burning desire to tear down falsehoods, but his weapon of choice would not be the play script. It would be the scalpel. In 1842, at the age of 18, Ludwig Büchner enrolled at the University of Gießen. If Darmstadt was the incubator, Gießen was the forge. At that time, Gießen was one of the most exciting places in the world to study science, largely due to one man, Justus von Liebig. Liebig is often called the father of the fertilizer industry, but his impact went far beyond agriculture. He was revolutionizing organic chemistry. Before Liebig, there was a vague notion that organic matter, living things, was fundamentally different from inorganic matter, rocks, minerals. The prevailing theory was vitalism, the idea that living beings were animated by a mystical, non-physical vis vitalis, vital force that could not be measured or replicated in a lab. Liebig was dismantling this idea piece by piece. He showed that the processes of life, digestion, respiration, growth, were chemical reactions. They followed the same laws of conservation of mass as a reaction in a test tube. You could analyze a plant, break it down into nitrogen, carbon, and water, and understand exactly how it grew. There was no magic involved. For young Büchner sitting in Liebig's lecture hall, this was a revelation. It was the first pillar of his materialist temple. Life is chemistry. But Büchner was restless. The German university system encouraged students to travel, to learn from different masters. In 1843, he moved to the University of Strasbourg. Here, he encountered a different intellectual current, the French rationalist tradition, which was far more skeptical of metaphysics than the dreamy German universities. However, the definitive moment in his intellectual formation came when he moved to the University of Würzburg to study pathology under the legendary Rudolf Virchow. If Liebig taught Büchner that life was chemistry, Virchow taught him that disease was cellular. Virchow is famous for the maxim omnis cellula e cellula. Every cell stems from another cell. He rejected the old medieval ideas of humors and the romantic ideas of spiritual imbalances. Virchow looked at the body as a state of cells, a complex republic of microscopic living units. When you got sick, it wasn't a punishment from God. It was a malfunction in the cellular machinery. Virchow was also a staunch materialist and a political radical who had fought on the barricades in Berlin during the 1848 revolution. He famously stated, "Medicine is a social science, and politics is nothing else but medicine on a large scale." He embodied the exact model Ludwig aspired to, the scientist-citizen, the man who used hard facts to fight for social progress. Büchner absorbed these lessons voraciously. He completed his dissertation in 1848, the very year the revolutions erupted across Europe. His topic was on the nervous system, specifically related to the theories of Marshall Hall regarding reflex actions. This was significant. By studying reflexes, Büchner was already probing the boundary between the automatic body and the conscious mind. He was seeing how much of animal behavior could be explained by simple mechanical wiring, without the need for a conscious soul. By the time he graduated and began looking for an academic post, Ludwig Büchner was no longer just a doctor. He was a man with a worldview that was rapidly crystallizing into a weapon. He had seen the vital force retreat further and further into the shadows with every new discovery in chemistry and physiology. He saw a scientific establishment that was uncovering the truth about the universe, but was too polite, too timid, or too politically compromised to say it out loud. He began to feel a sense of duty. The gap between what scientists knew in the lab and what the public was told in church was becoming a canyon. And Ludwig Büchner decided he was going to be the one to bridge it, even if he had to burn the bridge down behind him. In 1852, Büchner achieved what every young German intellectual dreamed of. He was appointed as a Privatdozent, private lecturer, at the University of Tübingen. Tübingen was prestigious, steeped in history, and deeply conservative. It was a stronghold of Protestant theology and Swabian piety. For a man like Büchner, it was the belly of the beast. But initially, he thrived. He was a charismatic lecturer capable of breaking down complex physiological concepts for his students. His research was solid. He had published respected papers in medical journals. He was on the fast track to a full professorship, but the silence was gnawing at him. During these early years at Tübingen, Büchner observed a strange phenomenon among his colleagues. In private, many of them admitted that the old religious explanations of the world made no sense in light of modern science. They knew that the biblical account of creation was myth. They knew that the soul was a physiologically redundant concept. Yet in public, they maintained a polite veneer of piety. They tipped their hats to the theologians. They kept the peace. Büchner despised this hypocrisy. He saw it as a betrayal of the very spirit of science. Writing later, he would describe this period as one of intense intellectual friction. He felt that science was being held hostage by philosophical word spinners and theological obscurantists. He began to write. At first, he likely intended to write a standard textbook or a series of essays. But as the ink flowed, the tone shifted. The frustration of the post-1848 era, the grief for his revolutionary brother, the clarity of Liebig's chemistry and Virchow's pathology, it all coalesced into a single fierce argument. He didn't write for the professors. He didn't write in the dense, impenetrable German academic style that was fashionable at the time and which was often used to hide dangerous ideas. He wrote for the people. He wrote for the educated merchant, the lawyer, the student, the thinking man. He wanted to democratize the dangerous truths of materialism. He gathered his notes, he organized his chapters, the immortality of matter, the immortality of force, brain and soul, the idea of God. He called the manuscript Kraft und Stoff. He sent it to a publisher, Meidinger, in Frankfurt. He must have known on some level that he was playing with fire, but he likely underestimated the explosion. He thought he was starting a debate. In reality, he was signing his own resignation letter. The year was 1855. The book was printed, but Büchner had no idea that these pages would ignite a national crisis that no one, least of all he, was prepared for. By all physical appearances, unremarkable. It was a modest octavo volume, bound in simple cloth, lacking the gilt edges or heavy leather spines that usually adorned the weighty philosophical treatises of the era. It sat on the shelves of bookstores, sandwiched between collections of romantic poetry and dry theological sermons. But this physical modesty was a deception. Inside those covers lay a text that possessed the incendiary power of a manifesto and the cutting precision of a surgical instrument. The book was titled Kraft und Stoff, Force and Matter. Its author was listed as Dr. Ludwig Büchner, a 31-year-old lecturer from the University of Tübingen, a name known only to a small circle of medical students and Hessian intellectuals. Within weeks of its release, the deceptive quiet was shattered. The book did not merely sell, it vanished from shelves as if looted. The first edition evaporated in days. A second edition was rushed to the press, then a third and a fourth. It was a phenomenon that defied the conventional logic of the German book market. Philosophy was supposed to be the preserve of the elite, written in a dense, impenetrable academic code that required a lifetime of study to decipher. But Büchner had committed a magnificent act of betrayal against his own class. He had written a philosophy book that was readable. He had taken the high-walled garden of metaphysics and smashed down the gates, inviting the mechanic, the school teacher, the apothecary, and the disgruntled student to come in and trample the flowers. The reception of Kraft und Stoff revealed a profound schism in the German soul. To the establishment, the ecclesiastical councils, the royal censors, and the tenured professors of philosophy, the book was a meteorite that had crashed through the roof of their orderly world. It was a gospel of dirt, a work of fanatical atheism that threatened to unravel the moral fabric of society. But to the reading public, it was oxygen. For a generation suffocated by the failure of the 1848 revolutions and weary of the endless abstract promises of religion, Büchner's brutal clarity was intoxicating. He offered them a world they could understand, a world made of the same hard stuff they worked with in the factories and fields. He told them that the universe was not a mysterious shadow play orchestrated by a hidden god, but a magnificent self-sustaining machine that required no driver. The style of the book was its first weapon. Büchner wrote with the swagger of a man who had burned his bridges before he even struck the match. He abandoned the polite hedging language of the academy. There were no perhapses, no on the other hands, no deferential nods to the wisdom of the ancients. His sentences were short, rhythmic, and percussive, hammering home his points like rivets in a steel beam. He utilized the metaphors of the emerging industrial age, speaking of steam, electricity, and magnetism. He turned the universe into a factory floor, stripping it of its ghosts and leaving only the humming, grinding reality of matter in motion. For 2,000 years, Western civilization had been built on the bedrock of dualism, the unshakable belief that reality was divided into two distinct substances, the material and the spiritual. The body was corruptible, heavy and mortal. The soul was ethereal, light and eternal. This distinction was not just a religious dogma. It was the political and social glue of the era. It justified the power of the church, the divine right of kings, and the promise that the suffering of the poor in this life would be rectified in the next. Büchner took this dualistic worldview and put it under the microscope, and then he announced with a calmness that infuriated his critics that the spirit was nowhere to be found. He proposed a radical monism. Matter and force, he wrote, are not two separate entities, but two sides of the same coin. There is no force without matter to carry it, and there is no matter without force to move it. This sounded like physics, but it was actually theology in reverse. If force cannot exist without matter, then a disembodied soul is a physical impossibility. A spirit without a body is like a smile without a face, a linguistic abstraction, not a reality. The most scandalous chapters of Kraft and Stoff were those that turned this materialist lens upon the human brain. At the time, even scientists who accepted the laws of physics for rocks and trees often drew a magic circle around the human mind. They were willing to admit that the heart was a pump and the stomach was a chemical vat. But the brain? The brain was the seat of the soul, the divine antenna where the breath of God interacted with clay. Büchner laughed at this exception. He applied the strictest physiological reductionism to the very seat of human consciousness. He famously championed the comparison of the brain to a machine, using the analogy of the steam engine, the crowning technological marvel of the 1850s, to illustrate his point. He asked his readers to consider the locomotive thundering down the tracks. Where does its power, its life, come from? Is there a spirit of speed hiding inside the iron wheels? No. The motion is the direct result of the chemical energy released by burning coal, transferring heat to water, creating steam pressure that moves the pistons. If the coal runs out, the motion stops. If the engine is smashed, the speed does not float away into the sky to live in a heaven of velocity. It simply ceases to exist. He applied this brutal logic to the human mind. Thought, he argued, is nothing more than the motion of matter within the brain. It is the functional activity of the nervous system, just as digestion is the functional activity of the stomach. He quoted his contemporary, Carl Vogt, who had shockingly declared that the brain secretes thought as the liver secretes bile and the kidneys secrete urine. While Büchner's phrasing was slightly more poetic, the meaning was identical. The soul is not a tenant living in the house of the body, it is the house. And when the house crumbles, the tenant vanishes. This conclusion was devastating. It meant that personal immortality was a lie. There was no pearly gate, no reunion with dead ancestors, no final judgment. When the brain died, the lights went out forever. For a society that was deeply religious and accustomed to viewing death as a transition rather than an end, this was a vision of existential horror. It stripped away the comforting blanket of eternity and left humanity shivering in the cold winds of a finite existence. Yet, Buchner insisted that this harsh truth was more noble than the sweet lies of the priests. He argued that realizing we have only one life would make that life infinitely more precious. It would compel us to build paradise here on earth through science and social justice, rather than waiting for a paradise that would never come. Buchner was the voice that carried the furthest, but he was not singing a solo. In the public imagination, he was the youngest member of a notorious triumvirate known as the Scientific Materialists, a group that included Carl Vogt and Jacob Mollschott. Together, they sparked what historians now call the Materialismusstreit, the materialism controversy, a ferocious intellectual civil war that raged across German universities in the 1850s. Carl Vogt was the brawler of the group, a massive bearded geologist with a booming voice and a sarcastic wit. Vogt had already lost his professorship at the University of Gießen for his radical activities during the 1848 revolution. He lived in exile in Geneva, from where he lobbed rhetorical grenades at the German establishment. Vogt delighted in shocking the bourgeoisie. He famously argued that humans were closer to apes than to angels, long before Darwin made it respectable to say so. If Büchner was the earnest evangelist of materialism, Vogt was its street fighter. Jacob Mollschott was the sensualist. A Dutch physiologist, he focused intensely on the relationship between nutrition and cognition. His famous aphorism, Der Mensch ist, was ist, man is what he eats, became the slogan of the movement. Mollschott argued that if you wanted to change a man's morals or his politics, you shouldn't preach to him. You should feed him better. He believed that the poverty and ignorance of the working class were not spiritual failings, but physiological consequences of poor diet and bad air. Büchner was the synthesizer. He took Vogt's combative evolutionism and Mollschott's physiological determinism and wove them together into a coherent, overarching worldview in Kraft und Stoff. He provided the philosophical framework that turned their scientific observations into a rival religion. The backlash against this trinity of infidels was ferocious. The term vulgar materialism was coined by their enemies to dismiss them. The word vulgar was a carefully chosen double insult. It meant common, sneering at the fact that they wrote in German for the masses rather than in Latin for the elite. But it also meant crude, implying that their philosophy was simplistic and lacked nuance. Leading the counterattack were the Neo-Kantians and the great theologians of the day. They accused Büchner of a fundamental category error. They argued that he was trying to measure the immeasurable. Just because a scalpel cannot find a soul, they said, does not mean it isn't there, any more than dissecting a radio will reveal the man speaking inside it. They attacked him on epistemological grounds, arguing that all our knowledge comes through the senses, and therefore we can never truly know the thing in itself, only our perception of it. By claiming to know the absolute nature of reality, that it is only matter, Büchner was being just as dogmatic as the priests he criticized. But the most stinging attacks were moral. Critics like Emanuel Hermann Fichte painted a terrifying picture of a world run by Büchner's rules. If we are just machines, Fichte argued, then there is no free will. If there is no free will, there is no moral responsibility. A steam engine cannot be guilty of murder. A chemical reaction cannot be sinful. If Büchner is right, the entire legal and moral framework of civilization collapses. We become beasts in a jungle, tearing each other apart without conscience. Büchner responded to these attacks with increasing defiance. He argued that morality did not come from the fear of a vengeful sky god, but from the natural social instincts of the human animal. We are good to each other because we are social species that need cooperation to survive. He believed that a morality based on reason and empathy would be far sturdier than one based on fear and superstition. While the debate raged in the newspapers and lecture halls, a much quieter, deadlier process was taking place within the administration of the University of Tübingen. The success of Kraft und Stoff was not a triumph for Dr. Büchner's career. It was his death warrant. Tübingen was not just a university. It was a fortress of Swabian Protestantism. It was a state institution funded by the Kingdom of Württemberg, and its primary mission was to produce loyal civil servants and Orthodox pastors. The fact that a member of its own faculty, a private docent charged with instructing the youth, was the author of the most notorious atheist tract in Europe was an intolerable embarrassment. The persecution of Ludwig Büchner was not a dramatic public heresy trial like that of Galileo. The 19th century was too polite for racks and thumbscrews. Instead, Büchner faced the cold, crushing weight of bureaucratic ostracism. It began with the silence. Colleagues who once praised his anatomical research now refused to acknowledge him in the corridors. A quiet but deliberate form of exile designed to socially erase him. Then came the administrative pressure. Complaints were quietly lodged with the Ministry of Education in Stuttgart. Pious parents wrote letters threatening to withdraw their sons if they were forced to attend lectures by the infidel doctor. The message was conveyed to Büchner through intermediaries, protecting the administration from having to make a formal accusation. The ultimatum was unspoken but clear. Retract the book, apologize for your errors, and return to the fold, or your career is over. For a young man of 31, standing on the threshold of a promising life, the temptation to capitulate must have been immense. He had spent his entire youth training for this position. He loved research. He loved teaching. If he stayed, he could look forward to a comfortable salary, a pension, and the high social status of a German professor. All he had to do was lie. All he had to do was say that he had been rash, that he had overstated his case, that he accepted the harmony of faith and science. But Ludwig Büchner was his brother's keeper. The ghost of Georg, who had died for his principles in exile, hovered over him. He possessed that specific, stubborn Hessian integrity that refused to bend the knee to authority. He believed that the duty of a scientist was to the facts, not to the feelings of the clergy. He looked at the hypocrisy of his colleagues, men who knew the truth but whispered it in private, while preaching orthodoxy in public, and he felt a profound disgust. He refused to recant. In a final act of dignity, he did not wait to be fired. He submitted his resignation. He packed his books, his microscope, and his papers. He walked out of his office at the University of Tübingen, hearing the heavy door click shut behind him. It was a sound that would echo for the rest of his life. He was not just leaving a job, he was being exiled from the Republic of Letters. In the 19th century, the university was the only home for serious scientific research. There were no independent labs, no corporate research centers. To be outside the university was to be an amateur, a hobbyist, a voice in the wilderness. Late in 1855, the exile returned to Darmstadt. It was a humiliating retreat. He had left as a prodigy, the son of the esteemed medical counselor, destined for greatness. He returned as a notorious pariah, the man who had thrown away his future for a dirty book. Darmstadt was a small, gossipy court city. Everyone knew everyone. As Büchner walked the streets, he could feel the eyes of the burghers on him. He had to rebuild his life from the ashes. He rented rooms and hung out a shingle, returning to the practice of practical medicine. This marked the beginning of his double life, a schizophrenia of existence that would define his remaining decades. His days belonged to medicine, his nights to the war of ideas. By day, he was Dr. Büchner, the beloved physician. He was a familiar sight in the town, walking with his medical bag to the homes of the sick. He set broken bones, delivered babies, and sat by the bedsides of the dying. He was known for his immense kindness, often waiving his fees for the poor and working-class families who could not afford to pay. In his medical practice, he lived out the humanist morality he preached, alleviating suffering not through prayer, but through skill and compassion. But by night, when the patients were asleep and the shutters were closed, Dr. Büchner vanished, and the arch-materialist emerged. He sat at his desk surrounded by stacks of foreign journals and letters, and he wrote with the fury of a man under siege. The isolation of Darmstadt did not break him, it hardened him. Stripped of his laboratory and his colleagues, he turned his study into a command center for the international free thought movement. He realized that while he had lost the battle for the university, he was winning the war for the public mind. Letters poured in from all over the world, from Russian students hiding in basements, from French Republicans, from English secularists, from American mechanics. They told him that Kraft und Stoff had opened their eyes. They told him that for the first time the world made sense, that he had liberated them from the fear of hell and the tyranny of priests. This correspondence became his lifeline. It was a shadow university, a republic of spirits that existed only on paper, but which sustained him through the long, lonely years of intellectual exile. He began to see himself not as a failed professor, but as a professor of the people. He realized that the universities were too compromised, too beholden to the state and the church to ever be truly free. The future of science lay with the people. And so the doctor of Darmstadt sharpened his pen. He prepared new editions of his book, adding more evidence, more venom, and more confidence. He was waiting for reinforcements, and he would not have to wait long. Across the English Channel, a reclusive naturalist named Charles Darwin was finally preparing to publish a theory that would vindicate everything Büchner had said and provide the one weapon the materialists were still missing, an explanation for life that did not require a designer. The year 1859 was approaching. The storm was about to become a hurricane. Since the publication of Kraft und Stoff, Büchner and his fellow materialists, Vogt and Molschott, had been fighting a war of attrition against the theologians. And while they were winning the skirmishes on chemistry and physics, they were in danger of losing the war on biology. They had successfully argued that the body was a machine and that the brain was a physical organ, but they faced one terrifying, unanswerable question that their enemies wielded like a cudgel. If there is no designer, whence comes the design? The Anglican clergyman William Paley had famously articulated the watchmaker argument decades earlier. If you find a watch on a heath with its complex gears and springs perfectly adapted to tell time, you must assume a watchmaker. You cannot assume the wind blew some metal shards together by accident. The natural world was filled with such watches. The crystalline lens of the eye, the aerodynamic curve of the eagle's wing, the intricate mimicry of the orchid. Büchner, in his early writings, had been forced into a corner. He could only offer vague philosophical assertions about the infinite productivity of nature, or spontaneous generation. He argued that given enough time and matter, forms would emerge, but he lacked the how. Without a mechanism to explain complex adaptation, without a designer, his materialism was a car without an engine, beautifully constructed, but unable to move forward. Then came the book from Kent. When Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in November 1859, It arrived in Germany not just as a scientific theory, but as a messianic revelation for the beleaguered materialist camp. For Büchner, reading Darwin was akin to a man lost in a dark cavern suddenly being handed a torch. Here, finally, was the missing mechanism. Natural selection was the answer to Paley's watchmaker. Darwin showed that nature did not need a conscious mind to create design. It only needed variation, inheritance, and the brutal, culling hand of death. The design was not planned forward, it was carved backward by the survival of the fittest. Büchner seized upon Darwinism with a fervor that was almost frightening in its intensity. It is important to note the stark contrast between the two men. Darwin was a cautious, retiring English gentleman, terrified of the social and religious implications of his own theory, constantly hedging his bets and avoiding conflict. Büchner was a combative, exiled German radical who saw science as a weapon to smash the old order. While Darwin hesitated to apply his theory to human beings or religion, Büchner had no such scruples. He immediately recognized that natural selection was the Archimedean lever that would overturn the entire history of Western metaphysics. He became one of Darwin's fiercest interpreters on the continent. While the great biologist Ernst Haeckel would later dominate the university debate on evolution, Büchner took the fight to the streets. He released new, rapidly expanded editions of Kraft und Stoff, weaving Darwin's data into the very fabric of his materialist philosophy. He argued that the universe was a single, unbroken causal chain. From the cooling of the primordial nebula to the formation of rocks, from the first chemical twitch of the protocell to the masterpieces of Shakespeare, it was all one process. There was no magic moment where God breathed a soul into the clay. There was no gap for a miracle to slip through. Evolution proved that monism was not just a philosophical guess, it was the physical law of the universe. Emboldened by this new arsenal, Büchner decided to launch a frontal assault on the last refuge of human vanity, our own origins. In 1869, he published his second magnum opus, The Place of Man in Nature, often translated as Man in the Past, Present, and Future. If Kraft und Stoff had killed the soul, this book was designed to kill human pride. At this time, in the late 19th century, a strange cognitive dissonance had settled over Europe. Many intellectuals were willing to accept that animals evolved. They could accept that a bear and a wolf shared a common ancestor, but they built a fortress around Homo sapiens. Humans, they insisted, were a special creation, endowed with reason and morality, separated from the beast by an unbridgeable chasm. Even Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of natural selection, eventually lost his nerve and claimed that the human brain must have been guided by spiritual forces. Büchner took a sledgehammer to this fortress. He compiled an exhaustive, encyclopedic array of evidence from the emerging fields of anthropology, comparative anatomy, and paleontology. He pointed to the newly discovered Neanderthal skull, found in the Neander Valley in 1856, not as a diseased freak, but as a ghost from our deep past. He cataloged the vestigial organs, the appendix, the tailbone, the muscles that wiggle the ears, as irrefutable receipts of our animal ancestry. Why would a perfect creator put a useless, infection-prone sac in the human gut? He wouldn't, but evolution would leave it there as a fading echo of a herbivorous past. The picture of human history that Büchner painted in this book was shocking to the Victorian sensibility. The Church taught the doctrine of the fall. Man began in Eden, perfect and immortal, and fell into sin and death. History was a tragedy of degeneration. Büchner flipped this narrative upside down. He depicted early humans not as noble atoms in a garden, but as terrified, hair-covered prognathodous bipeds shivering in caves, fighting hyenas with sharpened sticks. This was the gospel of ascent. Büchner argued that we are not fallen angels, but risen apes. Our history is not a slide into darkness, but a painful, bloody, and heroic climb toward the light. We fought our way up from the mud, conquering our bestial instincts through the development of tools, language, and social cooperation. This perspective was undeniably bleak in its violence. Büchner did not shy away from the brutality of the Stone Age, but it was profoundly optimistic in its implications. If we were not made perfect by God, then we are not broken. We are merely unfinished. And if we climb from the cave to the cathedral through our own efforts, there is no limit to how high we might climb in the future. As the 1870s dawned, the exile of Darmstadt found himself operating in a radically changed political landscape. The fragmentation of Germany was over. In 1871, Otto von Bismarck forged the German Empire through blood and iron. But this new Reich was dominated by Prussian conservatism and militarism, forces that Büchner, with his 1848 revolutionary roots, viewed with deep suspicion. The defining political conflict of the 1870s was the Kulturkampf, culture struggle, a bitter power struggle between Bismarck's state and the Catholic Church for control over education and civil society. Büchner found himself in a lonely, precarious third position. He despised the dogmatism of the Vatican, viewing the Pope as the archenemy of scientific progress. But he also distrusted the nationalist dogma of the Prussian state. He feared that Bismarck was simply replacing the tyranny of the priest with the tyranny of the bureaucrat. Büchner realized that science could not remain a spectator sport. It had to become a political movement. He began to articulate a vision of scientific humanitarianism. This was dangerous territory. He was applying the laws of biology to the structure of society. Later thinkers would twist Darwinism into social Darwinism, using the survival of the fittest to justify imperialism, racism, and the crushing of the poor. Büchner vehemently rejected this interpretation. He argued that while the struggle for existence was the law of the animal kingdom, the defining characteristic of human evolution was our ability to rebel against that law. We evolved intelligence and sympathy specifically to protect the weak, to care for the sick, and to cooperate rather than compete. For Büchner, the logical endpoint of evolution was not a jungle of ruthless capitalism, but a socialist society. He believed that the state should be an instrument of artificial selection for the good, providing education, health care, and fair wages to ensure that every human organism had the environment needed to flourish. To spread this message, Büchner transformed himself from a writer into an agitator. In 1881, he helped found the German Freethinkers League, Deutscher Freidenkerbund. He hit the lecture circuit, becoming a traveling evangelist for reason. We have accounts of these tours, the smoky, overcrowded beer halls in industrial cities like Hamburg and Berlin, the faces of factory workers, mechanics, and trade unionists upturned in the gaslight, listening to the famous doctor explain cell division and the history of the cosmos. He was a mesmerizing speaker. He did not talk down to the workers. He treated them as intellectual equals, telling them that they were not sheep to be herded by a Kaiser or a bishop, but free, thinking products of nature. He campaigned for the separation of church and state, for the removal of religious instruction from schools, and, in a particularly controversial move, for the right to cremation. The church opposed cremation because it symbolically denied the resurrection of the body. Buchner championed it as a sanitary, rational, and final assertion of materialism, a clean return of atoms to the earth, without the superstitious pageantry of the grave. Amidst the thunder of public controversy, the private life of Ludwig Büchner revealed a man deeply sensitive to the injustices of his age, particularly regarding the status of women. In this, he found his greatest intellectual partner in his own sister, Louise Büchner. Louise was not merely Ludwig's sister, she was a formidable force in her own right, a pioneer of the German feminist movement who fought tirelessly for women's access to education and professional employment. The relationship between the two siblings was a touching alliance of mind and heart. They lived together in Darmstadt for many years, turning their home into a salon for radical thought. Büchner applied his materialist lens to the woman question, and once again, he arrived at a conclusion that put him decades ahead of his time. The scientific consensus of the late 19th century, championed by men like Paul Broca and Gustave Le Bon, was profoundly sexist. These scientists measured skulls and weighed brains, arguing that because women had smaller brains on average than men, they were biologically incapable of higher reasoning and belonged in the kitchen. Büchner attacked this craniometric pseudoscience with fury. He argued that brain size was relative to body size, and that when adjusted for weight, women's brains were structurally identical to men's. He contended that the perceived intellectual inferiority of women was not a fact of nature, but a result of atrophy through disuse. For centuries, society had denied women education, stimulation, and opportunity. The female mind had been stunted by the environment, not by biology. He famously wrote that the brain is an organ that grows with use, arguing that if you opened the universities to women, their mental muscles would develop just as robustly as men's. In an era when women were considered decorative property, Büchner's assertion of female intellectual equality was a radical act of scientific solidarity. However, as the century wound down and Büchner entered his 60s and 70s, a creeping melancholy began to infuse his writings. He was tired. The battles were endless. The golden age of materialism of the 1850s and 60s was fading. A new intellectual mood was rising in Germany, one that Büchner found alien and repulsive. The optimism of the mid-century liberals, who believed that science would inevitably lead to freedom and peace, was being crushed by the rise of virulent nationalism and anti-Semitism. Historians like Heinrich von Treitschke were teaching that Germans were a master race and that Jews were a foreign cancer. Büchner, who had many Jewish colleagues and friends in the medical and scientific community, watched with horror as the biology he loved was twisted into a weapon of racial hatred. He insisted that the lesson of evolution was the unity of the human species, that race was a superficial adaptation to climate, not a deep spiritual division. But he was swimming against the tide. The Germany of his old age was becoming harder, colder, and more irrational. The universities which had exiled him for being too radical were now becoming incubators for a far more dangerous kind of radicalism, the ideologies of blood and soil that would eventually consume the 20th century. Büchner remained a man of the Enlightenment, a believer in universal reason, stranded in an age that was increasingly turning to myth and power. He continued to write, to lecture, and to fight. But the tone of his later letters suggests a man who knew he was a relic. He was a general whose army had disbanded, fighting a rearguard action against the gathering dark. He had destroyed the old gods of the church, but he watched with dread as new, darker gods of the state and the race rose to take their place. The tragedy of Ludwig Büchner was not just that he was exiled from his career, but that he lived long enough to see his dream of a rational world slipping away, even as his scientific truths were being vindicated. By the early 1870s, Büchner was a man approaching 50, hardened by 15 years of constant academic guerrilla warfare. In Germany, he was the infidel doctor, a man whose name was spoken in whispers by respectable citizens and shouted as a curse from the pulpits. He lived in a state of suspended professional animation, famous but ostracized, a general without an army. Then came the invitation from across the Atlantic. The United States, fresh from the bloodletting of its Civil War, was a nation in the throes of a raw, chaotic, and energetic reconstruction. It was a land less burdened by the medieval ghosts that haunted the universities of Europe. Furthermore, it was home to a massive diaspora of German intellectuals, the 48ers, who had fled the failed revolutions of 1848 to seek liberty in the New World. To these men and women, the name Büchner was not a scandal. It was a connection to the dream of freedom they had left behind. Büchner's journey to America was more than a lecture tour. It was a pilgrimage to a possible alternative reality. As he traveled by steamship and rail from the bustling port of New York to the slaughterhouses and steel mills of Chicago, he was met not with the polite, chilly silence of Tübingen, but with raucous, overwhelming enthusiasm. He spoke in crowded turn halls and opera houses, his lectures often standing room only. The German-American secular societies treated him like a visiting head of state. They saw in his materialism the philosophical counterpart to the American spirit, practical, grounded, democratic, and unafraid of tradition. In his letters home, one detects a note of wistful wonder. In America, Büchner found a society where a man could speak his mind on God, the soul, and the origins of life without fearing the censor's red ink or the bureaucrat's rebuke. He engaged in fierce, open debates with American clergymen, battles of wit that were conducted with a rough-and-tumble respect rather than the sneering elitism he faced at home. He saw a society that judged a man by what he could do and what he knew, not by his adherence to an ancient creed. However, the tour was also a mirror that reflected the tragedy of his own situation. Standing on stages in Philadelphia or Milwaukee, basking in the applause of thousands who hung on his every word about the indestructibility of force, Büchner must have felt the sharp sting of the life he was denied in his homeland. He realized that his exile was not a result of his lack of talent, but a result of his geography. He had been born in a cage when he boarded the ship to return to Europe, leaving the Statue of Liberty behind him. He was returning voluntarily to his cell in Darmstadt, carrying with him the bittersweet knowledge that, in another world, he would have been a hero. Upon his return to the newly unified German Empire, Büchner found the atmosphere growing steadily more suffocating. The 1880s and 1890s in Europe were marked by a cultural phenomenon known as the fin de siècle, the end of the century. It was a time of decadence, weariness, and a profound reaction against the rationalism that Büchner championed. The bright, hard light of science, which had seemed so promising in the 1850s, was now viewed by the younger generation as sterile and cold. They were bored with atoms and molecules. They wanted mystery. They wanted the unknown. This cultural malaise gave birth to a massive resurgence of occultism, spiritualism, and theosophy. In the drawing rooms of the upper classes, it became fashionable to hold seances, to hire mediums to rap on tables, and to try to photograph ghosts. Figures like Madame Blavatsky captivated the public imagination with talk of secret wisdom and astral planes. For Ludwig Büchner, this was not merely a harmless fad. It was a terrifying regression. It was as if the human mind having finally clawed its way out of the swamp of superstition, was voluntarily diving back in. He viewed spiritualism as a betrayal of the Enlightenment, a cowardly retreat from the harsh truths of reality into a fantasy world of spook hunting. Büchner spent his final years acting as the watchdog of reason. He engaged in bitter polemics against prominent scientists who had fallen prey to the occult. His most famous feud was with Johann Carl Friedrich Zöllner, a distinguished astrophysicist who had convinced himself that spirit mediums were using the fourth dimension to perform magic tricks. Büchner attacked Zöllner with merciless logic, arguing that when a scientist starts believing in magic, he ceases to be a scientist and becomes a theologian in a lab coat. He revised Kraft and Stoff repeatedly, adding chapters that specifically debunked the claims of mediums. He explained spirit wrappings as the cracking of knee joints, ectoplasm as cheesecloth and egg whites, and telepathy as coincidence and confirmation bias. He stood like a lighthouse keeper in a gathering storm, shouting into the wind that the laws of thermodynamics do not bend for ghosts. He insisted that the universe is a closed system of energy. There are no trapdoors for spirits to enter or exit. It was a lonely, thankless task. To the young symbolist poets and mystical philosophers of the 1890s, Büchner appeared as a grumpy relic, a man obsessed with a boring mechanical universe that they had outgrown. They did not understand that his boring universe was the only thing standing between them and the madness of the Dark Ages. The end came in the spring of 1899. Ludwig Büchner was 75 years old. The century he had helped to define was bleeding away, and so was his strength. He died on April 30th, in the same town where he was born, completing the circle of his life in the geographic confinement of Darmstadt. The death of a famous atheist in the 19th century was a high-stakes public event. For decades, the clergy had propagated the myth of the infidel's deathbed. They preached that when the end truly came, when the shadows lengthened and the cold breath of the grave was felt, the arrogance of the materialist would crumble. They predicted that Büchner would crack, that he would scream for a priest, that he would renounce his gospel of dirt in a final desperate wager for salvation. The vultures of the church were circling, waiting for a moment of weakness they could exploit to discredit his life's work. They waited in vain. Ludwig Büchner died exactly as he had lived, lucid, calm, and utterly unafraid. There were no hysterics, no recantations, and no pleas to the ceiling. He faced the extinguishing of his consciousness with the stoic dignity of a man who had made peace with the laws of physics. He knew with absolute certainty that he was merely a temporary arrangement of atoms, a pattern of energy that was about to dissolve back into the great cosmic reservoir. He did not fear hell, for he knew it was a fiction. He did not crave heaven, for he knew his immortality lay in the work he left behind and the matter that would return to the earth. His funeral, held a few days later, became a final silent act of political defiance. In the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the funeral rite was the exclusive property of the church. To be buried without a pastor, without the blessing of God, was to be buried like a dog. It was a social scandal that marked the family with shame. But the Büchner family, true to their rebel heritage, refused to compromise. They organized a strictly secular service. There were no bells ringing from the church towers. There was no incense, no cross, no reading of the Psalms. Instead of a priest in vestments, the grave was surrounded by a different kind of congregation. Hundreds of people gathered at the cemetery gates. There were delegates from the Freethinkers League holding banners of reason. There were scientists and doctors who admired his courage, But most touchingly, there were the common people of Darmstadt, the factory workers, the tradesmen, the poor mothers whose children Büchner had treated for free. They stood in a silence that was louder than any hymn. They were there to honor the man who had told them that they were not slaves of a distant God, but masters of their own destiny. Notable by their absence were the official representatives of the state and the university. The institutions that had exiled him in life maintained their cold shoulder, even in death. They hoped that by ignoring his funeral, they could erase his memory. They hoped that the earth would swallow his dangerous ideas along with his body. Though the establishment believed they had silenced him, history has vindicated Ludwig Büchner. His once dangerous intuition that the mind is physical and humanity is inextricably linked to nature has become the fundamental premise of the modern world. Yet his story remains a profound tragedy of unfulfilled potential. Had the academic world valued truth over conformity, Büchner might have stood alongside scientific titans like Pasteur or Pavlov. Instead, he was exiled from the laboratory, forced to sacrifice his professional ambitions to fight defensive battles with his pen. He sacrificed his peace to preserve his intellectual honesty. Ultimately, Büchner left us something more durable than theory: dignity. By stripping away spiritual crutches, he forced us to face reality on its own terms. He taught us that while we may be nothing more than dust, we are thinking dust, magnificent enough to understand the universe that made us without the need for comforting fairy tales.